come back to you in the program. Joining us now is CNN legal analyst Ariva Martin. She's a civil rights attorney. Also with us, retired LAPD Police Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey. She's the author of Black and Blue. Sergeant Dorsey, I want to start with you, and I want to play here Chauvin's call to his supervisor. Okay, so this is where he's recapping what has just happened. A man has just died under his knee, and here is how he communicates that to his supervisor.
Hello, 2:30 here. Yeah, I was just going to call you and have you come out to our scene here. Not really, but we just had to hold the guy down. He was going crazy. Wouldn't go in. Turn off for the moment. Wouldn't go in the back of the squad.
Yeah. So what you heard there was he was going crazy. He wouldn't go in the back of the squad car. Doesn't mention that his knee was on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. What did you hear, Sergeant?
So we hear an officer lying to a supervisor, and we know that he was trying to mitigate and minimize that use of force. He wasn't forthright when he didn't give all of the details. He's already trying to dissuade the supervisor for looking for witnesses once he arrived on scene. Yeah, the crowd, they're not really cooperating. They're really uncooperative, and they're unruly, and Mr. Floyd was, crazy, failing around, and we couldn't get him in the back of the police car. All a lie, because he was in the back of a police car. And we know from the supervisor's testimony that he was under control once the handcuffs went on. And so once the handcuffs go on, everything else that happened after that is problematic and going to be hard for them to explain.
Ariva, speaking of his supervisor, we heard testimony from George Floyd's the officer's supervisor yesterday, and I want to play what he said. Take a listen.
Do you have an opinion as to when the restraint of Mr. Floyd should have ended in this encounter?
Yes.
What is it?
When Mr. Floyd was no longer offering up any resistance to the officers, they could have ended the restraint.
And that was after he was handcuffed and on the ground and no longer resistant?
Correct.
We've heard from his supervisor, from the EMTs. How significant is it that we haven't heard any members of law enforcement to date defend Derek Chauvin?
I think it's very significant, John. From reporting on these cases, in these high-profile cases, typically we see police officers come to the aid. They come and support the actions of police officers. We haven't seen that in this case at all. Mm-hmm. And yesterday we saw this sergeant who worked for the police department, not a paid expert, give devastating testimony about the use of force. We knew it was coming. We know it's a central part of this case in terms of excessive force. It came a little earlier than expected. And if you note, the defense attorney didn't seem all prepared for it. In fact, had to object a little later in that testimony as to voir dire the sergeant to try to establish that foundationally he wasn't in a position to give that use of force testimony. The judge ultimately let the sergeant give that narrow opinion that, yes, once the handcuffs were on, the restraint should have ended immediately. It didn't, and therefore leaving the jurors hearing that excessive force was used against Mr. Floyd. Very devastating for the defense's position.
Sergeant Dorsey, I know you're not a lawyer, but it's not going well so far for Derek Chauvin. It doesn't appear to be. There's, as John just said, there's nobody defending his position. There's nobody justifying what he did. All that's happening so far is that everybody else on the stand is showing their humanity, showing their empathy, showing their guilt over what happened. And he is being, at the moment, depicted as kind of a psychopath, to tell you the truth. I mean, but who knows what happens when the case turns and when the defense makes their case. Would you expect police officers to come to his defense? I mean, what is the dynamic among that group of police officers that we see in that video from your eyes?
Well, for the officers that were on scene, certainly they acquiesced misconduct. The people who are under oath, who are testifying under the penalty of perjury, are speaking truthfully and honestly about the use of force and the fact that it was unnecessary. And so no one can defend the indefensible. And we hear now from credible professionals who you cannot argue with. When a paramedic says that was a dead man he was kneeling on, you've got to believe him. When a firefighter, although off duty, says, I could have rendered aid and they would wouldn't allow me. I could tell that the man, Mr. Floyd, was in distress. They wouldn't allow me to intervene. You've got to give weight to that testimony. And so what Mr. Chauvin did was indefensible, and no police officer in their right mind is going to acquiesce what was misconduct and ultimately murder.
Sometimes the lack of defense is an indication it's indefensible. Ariva, you know, at the opening of this week, we heard the defense try to demonize George Floyd, try to other him, particularly by raising the specter of drugs and saying that maybe that is what led to his death. But we saw the prosecution kind of judo move that yesterday by putting his girlfriend on the stand to talk about their shared struggle with opioids. I want to play that clip for you.
Both Floyd and I, our story, it's a classic story of how many people get addicted to opioids. We both suffered from chronic pain. Mine was in my neck and his was in his back.
Were you surprised to see the prosecution take this approach, and do you think it'll be effective?
Not surprised by it, John, and I thought it was a brilliant approach. It's called fronting. It's when prosecutors know there's some evidence that's going to come out in a trial that might be damning or maybe difficult for jurors to hear. They get it out first. They get it out in their case. They take the sting out of that testimony, therefore preventing the defense from using it in a way that could be devastating. And I think Ms. Ross, so poised, even though she was very emotional, told a story that so many Americans can relate to, which is getting addicted to pain medication because you started out in some kind of chronic pain. So these weren't people that were just on the streets, looking for illegal drugs. And I think the way she told the story really allowed jurors to connect with her and the pain that she experienced, not just for Mr. Floyd, but for herself. And I think that was really well done by the prosecution and hurt the defense's case.
But Ariva, very quickly, do you think the fact that she didn't know about his heroin overdose, which is what the defense brought out, do you think that hurts the prosecution's case?
I think that was a good move on the part of the defense to bring that out. I wish the prosecution had allowed her to tell that part of the story during her testimony. But one thing we should note, Allison, is the defense's position is that he had an overdose in May in the same way that he had in March. But the problem with that argument is after that overdose in March, he walked out of that hospital. He was doing just fine. He continued to engage in physical activities. And so the argument that the overdose is the cause of his death, I don't think is going to work. And in the state of Minnesota, all that prosecution has to prove is that the actions of Chauvin were a substantial cause of his death, and that gets them to the conviction that they're going for in this case.
Ladies, really helpful. Sergeant Dorsey, Ariva Martin, thank you both very much for your expertise.